The first two questions we ask when we talk about the reliability of the Book of Mormon is, where did the original source material come from, and how did it come to be translated into the first edition of the Book of Mormon? And indeed, what's the process that was taken to get us from there to here? So let's go back and look at the source of information, the golden plates themselves. With reference to these, we only have the testimony of 3 witnesses and the testimony of 8 witnesses, both testimonies found written in the front of every Book of Mormon. Now, when you read the testimony of 3 witnesses, you realize that it's deliberately a testimony of a spiritual vision of the plates and not a physical viewing of the plates. For that reason, in this particular court of law, we'd have to throw this evidence out because these 3 witnesses never really saw golden plates. They just saw spiritual visions of them. You read the testimony of 8 witnesses, and now it appears as though they've seen physical plates themselves. And that's a good sign for our evidence here. However, when you listen to the testimony of these 8 witnesses throughout the course of their lifetimes, it appears as though we are presuming they saw actual plates. It sounds like from their extended lifetime witnesses that they really saw visions as well. Dan Vogel did a great research into that very thing with those 8 witnesses and came up with an essay called The Validity of the Witnesses' Testimony, which is one of several essays in American Apocrypha. He concludes with this statement: given the fact that the 3 witnesses saw a vision and that the experience of the 8 witnesses seems to have been similarly visionary, there's no compelling evidence that Joseph Smith actually possessed anciently constructed plates. So it seems as though the testimony of a lifetime of the 8 witnesses contradicts the physical nature of their testimony. It seems as though they also saw visions. Again, evidence that we'd have to throw out in this court of evidence regarding the existence of the gold plates. In addition, in this courtroom, we would have to ask about the integrity of the witnesses to start with. Are they credible? Are they reliable? In fact, do their lives live out in a consistent fashion what they said to be true in the beginning? In the same way that Jesus' 12 apostles, 11 of them died martyrs' deaths rather than disavow the truth of what they said about Jesus. Do these 8 or 3 or 11 witnesses live out that same testimony consistent with their initial testimonies written in front of the Book of Mormon? Unfortunately, they don't. Grant Hardy, a Mormon himself who published a reader's edition of the Book of Mormon, allowed in his Appendix 2 in the back and said this: despite the fact that many of these witnesses fall out with Joseph Smith and leave the church, none ever deny their testimony of the Book of Mormon. And it's true. The majority of these witnesses have a severe falling out with Joseph Smith to the degree in which they accuse him of being a false prophet, and they leave the church. What's lost on most people who quote the second half of Hardy's phrase here, none ever deny their testimony in the Book of Mormon, is the fact that the very moment that they accuse Joseph Smith of being a false prophet, they also deny him the ability supernaturally to translate the Book of Mormon from the golden plates. If he's a false prophet, he's a false translator as well. Well, let's move on to the process of actually translating the plates, if the plates ever existed. And this picture probably comes to mind: Joseph Smith reading the golden plates and writing down on a piece of paper. Or actually, we're missing something here. It's probably more like this. Yeah, we have a scribe, Oliver Cowdery or Martin Harris by name, who would write down what Joseph Smith dictated as he read the plates. But this picture, too, is wrong because of the very fact that the golden plates are in the picture. Yeah, that's right. A better picture is probably something more like this: Joseph Smith with his face in a hat. It turns out all the credible, reliable historical accounts about how Joseph Smith translated the golden plates never involve him ever looking at the golden plates. Instead, his head is in a hat looking at visions from God. This, according to David Whitmer in an address to all believers in Christ, and which also, interestingly, is substantiated and endorsed by an Ensign article in July 1993 by Apostle Russell Nelson. So what did Whitmer say? Whitmer wrote, Joseph Smith would put the seer stone into a hat and put his face in the hat, drawing it closely around his face to exclude the light, and in the darkness the spiritual light would shine. A piece of something resembling parchment would appear, and on that appeared the writing. One character at a time would appear, and under it was the interpretation in English. Brother Joseph would read off the English to Oliver Cowdery, who was his principal scribe, and when it was written down and repeated to Brother Joseph to see if it was correct, then it would disappear and another character with the interpretation would appear. Thus, the Book of Mormon was translated by the gift and power of God and not by any power of man. And so by this incredible account, Whitmer claims that Joseph Smith translated the golden plates, A, by never looking at them, and B, by seeing visions in a hat instead. And C, in an inerrant process. That is, God would not allow the image of the translation to go away until the scribe, Cowdery or Harris, accurately and perfectly transcribed it, ink onto paper. This inerrant process was also seemingly endorsed by Joseph Smith himself in History of the Church when he claimed this: "I told the brethren that the Book of Mormon was the most correct of any book on earth and the keystone of our religion, and a man would get nearer to God by abiding by its precepts than by any other book." This statement, plus Whitmer's statement about the actual inerrant process of the translation, would lead us to believe that the 1830 edition is absolutely perfect and unchanged. And is that the case in the subsequent editions of the Book of Mormon all the way up until the 1981 version, which is the source of our present-day version? Is it unchanged? Well, it's not. And courtesy of Gerald and Sandra Tanner, who published some time ago a book that catalogs the nearly 4,000 changes in the Book of Mormon, we know that the 1830 version has undergone extensive changes. And they did this in a very simple process. They photocopied pages from the Book of Mormon, courtesy of the University of Utah, this first edition, and replicated these pages in this book and then just hand annotated where the changes were with the modern translation. Now, granted, many of these are spelling changes and grammar changes, which also tend to challenge the inerrant process, by the way. But many of these changes are also of serious content change. Let me just show you a couple of them. In the 1830 version, in Ether 4:1, you'll read this: "For this cause did King Benjamin keep them." And yet, if you read anytime after 1849 printings, you'll read Ether 4:1 to say, "For this cause did King Mosiah keep them." In filmmaking, this is what we call a continuity error in the script. That is, when a character can't possibly be in a certain scene because they've either been killed or don't exist anymore. And that's the case right here, too. Someone by 1849 realized that Benjamin couldn't be in this phrase, must be Mosiah. That's a serious challenge, again, to the inerrant process from the first edition. One other example from the 1830, 1 Nephi 11:21 in the first edition reads, "Yea, even the Eternal Father." When you get to the second edition in 1837, it now reads, "Yea, even the Son of the Eternal Father." This is a serious content shift that this inerrant process should have caught. So we looked at the origin and the subsequent translations of the Book of Mormon and brought up questions about whether the golden plates even existed because of the veracity of the witnesses, where the process of never looking at the golden plates might really bring danger to the edition itself. And then, because of the inerrant process itself, why it is we have 4,000 changes into the modern edition. If you want to read more about this, here's some great research sites that you can take a look at to find more information. And before we end, I just want to give a nod towards Grant Palmer's book, An Insider's View of Mormon Origins, which has a wonderful reference and a detailed research into how this process came to be.